Thanks to everyone for joining Sound Studies Institute this evening for our talk. We're coming to you from Musculoskeletal, sometimes known as Edmonton, Alberta. We're in Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional territory of numerous Indigenous people, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Inuit, and many others. And today it is the home of many diverse peoples, and we all welcome you here, virtual or otherwise. If you're just joining us this evening for the first time, this is a lecture series by the Sound Studies Institute at the University of Alberta. We're a research institute that supports research and creative activities that centralize sound in any way. SSI offers our researchers opportunities to work collaboratively and to network and discover new areas of inquiry, benefit from administrative support, and we provide many of our affiliate researchers opportunities to present on this lecture series, as well as many others, including our guest this evening. I want to thank Oliver Rossier, Tom Merklinger, and Gail Mandrick for their support in helping me run this institute, and also want to just note to everyone that we will be recording the lecture this evening for future audiences. And if you do not wish to be part of that recording, please just know that you can keep your video disabled, and we won't, and that won't be on the video. And as well, if you would prefer to have your questions answered via the chat, after the talk, we can do it that way. And speaking of which, we will ask you to stay muted and with your video off during the talk itself, just so that the bandwidth is working good. And then once we've gotten to the end, we'll have a little bit of time for question and answers, hopefully some answers. So I also say, and let me put this link in the chat here, if you're interested in learning more about the Institute or contributing to the Institute, I've just put the link to our website in the chat, and you can take a look at our programs. And without further ado, I want to introduce the speaker tonight. We're really happy to present a talk called "It Hurts When I Play: Canadian Validation of Musicians' Health Assessment Battery." And this is being brought to you by Christine Guptill, who is someone who unfortunately left U of A recently and is now in occupational therapy in the University of Ottawa. So we were sad to lose her, but she's still affiliated here, and we're really happy to have her here this evening to talk about a project that I've known a little bit about since she came to the music department and pitched the project to us a few years ago. She's going to be presenting on a research project that she completed when she was here that examines the feasibility of employing assessment battery developed particularly by colleagues in Germany to investigate mental and physical health of university music students in Canada. It sounds like they've gotten a lot of really interesting results from this study, and I'm really happy to be hearing about it this evening. And I also want to welcome Julius Bruder here as well, who is a graduate student who will also be presenting some work tonight, who's worked with Christine on this project. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Christine Guptill tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. Yeah, and I really should have put Julius's name on the slide. Julius, we should have talked about that. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself as well. Why don't I just give you a second to do that before I move forward?
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Julius Bruder, and I am originally from Germany, and we will get into how I came to work with Christine a little later. But yeah, I was originally trained as a physiotherapist in Germany and tried to transfer that here to Canada. But now I'm in education, so that's how life goes.
Yes. Right. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. I apologize for some strange reason. Now that we've pressed record, I think, or something, I'm not able to see any of you. So it's great to have you here, and I'm looking forward to the questions later when I stop sharing and Please go ahead and write any questions you want in the chat. I don't imagine we'll get to them until the talk is over, but absolutely more than happy to have your questions, and I'm glad that you could come. And I put two pictures of two gentlemen who had a strong influence on my development when I was a music student myself on the front page here, because I think it's important to acknowledge our mentors, but also this is my music background. So the top person is Ian Franklin, who was my oboe teacher, who was the previous principal oboe player of Orchestra London, Canada. And that's where I studied with him in London at Western University. And then the person on the bottom is Jim Mackay. And Jim was actually the bassoon prof at the time. They've both since retired. And because Jim was the bassoon prof, and as happens so often at music schools, there weren't enough double reed players. And so one year we had masterclass with Jim, and that just happened to be the year. So when I had masterclass with Jim, happened to be the year that he was also conducting the two orchestras that I was playing in and directing our quintet. So I literally saw Jim at least every day, if not 2 or 3 times a day. And so they both had a very strong influence on my development as a musician. And I'm very grateful that I did that and that I have that background and am able now to kind of support my peers and my colleagues in some of the problems that I encountered when I was a music student as well. So just to kind of give a little bit of tiny background, I throw up a picture. This is part of the reason that I've moved back to Ontario. I do have family in Ontario, and we do have a family cottage where the surroundings look a lot like this, although this is not actually from the cottage. This is from a canoe trip we did. But I'm a registered occupational therapist, and I teach OT at the University of Ottawa. So it is a fully kind of tenure track sort of position, but I'm kind of grounded in the practical piece of it, in that I'm always teaching future occupational therapists. As you can tell, I am an oboist, and my research program really focuses on musicians' health, and I take a work disability prevention perspective to that work. So that means that I look very much at ways of minimizing the disabilities that musicians might encounter during their career. And we minimize in a lot of different ways through sort of prevention and through proper care and access to care. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation as well. But if you had questions about that later, I'm more than happy to talk about other projects we're working on in terms of my collaborations. So just to give a little bit of international perspective to what this presentation is about, around the world, there are a variety of different organizations that have become interested in musicians' health, and I'll talk about why as well. In the UK, we have the British Association for Performing Arts Medicine, and in recent years, BAPM is what they're called, has been quite busy in kind of more prevention and research areas, collaborating with different organizations. You may see in the popular media some things that are coming out of the UK, projects you might have heard called helpmusicians.uk, which are not necessarily associated with BAPM, but there are some people who kind of cross work between BAPM and that organization. One of the key features that BAPM has, which I think is really really cool, is that they actually have clinics once a week throughout the entire UK. And physicians and therapists will actually volunteer their time to work at those clinics. And when I first heard that, I was a little bit baffled because our system wouldn't require them to volunteer. But if you want to see somebody at a particular time point in the national health system, you'd have to work outside of the national health system because the wait list operates differently. So that's why they have to volunteer. In the Netherlands, we have a fairly large organization of performing arts. And some of the research that's been going on in the Netherlands more recently, say in the last 5-10 years, and one of my collaborators, one of my friends and collaborators there, they've been running trials at conservatories. And so there have been trials run at 5 different conservatories in the Netherlands looking at ways to prevent and assess musicians' injuries. In the US, the college programs are generally regulated by the National Association for Schools of Music, although I kind of shake my head because some of the best ones are not. Some of them don't feel that they need to be accredited by NASM. So Juilliard, for example, is not accredited by NASM. But NASM does require in their guidelines for being accredited education on injury prevention and hearing protection. And that's an important component of, as schools begin to go through accreditation, and they do that, I think, about every 7 years, they need to demonstrate that they're offering that sort of education. And so that was an important step forward in terms of once one college does it, then competitors feel that they need to keep up, and that has been trickling up to Canada as well. And in Canada, we don't have accreditation, but we do have an organization. So many of you will probably be familiar with MUSCAN, which is the Canadian University Music Society. And there are curriculum guidelines that MUSCAN has established, and I would say that pretty much all of the music schools are in compliance with those guidelines. And a paragraph on health and safety was introduced to those curriculum guidelines back in 2015, I believe it might have been 14. I did see a first draft of it. And so that paragraph is really sort of all we have in terms of our guidelines for offering safe curriculum to music students. And I would add that, if you make a curriculum safe for students, you're also going to be helping the staff and faculty. So that's an important goal, I think. And so we need to continue to ask for more of that. It really is getting to the point where it is, as I say, becoming a bit mandatory because of competitive nature. So as one school begins to recognize that these things are important, then others do as well. And I'm more than happy to share this PowerPoint with Dr. Smallwood afterwards, so that if people are interested in having these links, you're more than happy to have them. They are a little bit long, but you can see that the hearing health and the neuromuscular and vocal health guidelines are actually available through the NASM website. So if you dig around, you can find them. We did write at the Performing Arts Medicine Association a guideline on psychological health, and that was submitted to NASM, but as far as I know, it has not been officially adopted. So it does exist. To move on and talk about why am I even so interested in all of this, what's great is that I did this postdoc in work disability prevention, and when I started to compare, oh, I've left a little note to myself in there, that's haha funny. The question marks are because I was going to add 2 other references, so I'll happily add those later and send off the PowerPoint to Dr. Smallwood. But when I talk to other people in other work fields, so in other industries, and I tell them that over 80% of musicians will encounter a problem with playing that interferes with their ability to perform on their instrument or sing over the course of their career, they're kind of shocked. That's a very, very high prevalence. You can imagine that if this was affecting an industry like mining, for example, that people would be picketing and shouting in the streets. So it is a little bit high, although of course our careers are quite long. And so the chances of us running into something are also, relatively higher, I would say. But of those, when we've looked at professional musicians, 50% of professional musicians are reporting that they are currently injured to a degree where they can't perform to the level that they're accustomed to performing. And only 40% of those people who have encountered injury over their career, consider themselves recovered from that injury. That doesn't necessarily mean that they can't perform, but would they say that they've recovered? That's another question. And so one of the interesting things about this for me is, as a healthcare practitioner, not being as concerned with sort of curing the problem, but more being concerned with how can we best support musicians in their careers to continue to do what they want to do, and get them back to doing that as quickly and efficiently as possible, understanding that there's going to be peaks and valleys throughout their careers, that they may kind of continue to have that issue crop up when things are not going so well over the course of their career. And that's not unlike what we see in athletes. And you'll see that some of those parallels will continue through this presentation. So among school-age students, we still see this. And so we've talked for quite some time about the fact that these seem to crop up early and follow people through their careers. So when we look at school-age students, we're seeing 67% of school-age students reporting musculoskeletal injuries, and that's from a study by Sonia Ranelli in 2011. And then if we switch over to talking about mental health, and I certainly don't see these two things, physical and mental health, as separate. As an OT, my scope of practice includes both physical and mental health, although my past experience has been more in the physical health range. But certainly they absolutely contribute to each other and are part of the same thing. There's certainly no way that you could have a career-ending physical injury without it bothering you emotionally. So the lifetime prevalence we see with mental health problems is over 70%. So it's, you know, in the range of the same as physical health. And so we have a variety of studies that have told us that that's the case. And so it's been quite stable over time. We've not really made a big impact on changing it. I wanted to bring this slide in just to talk about the fact that we sometimes speculate about why musicians have these challenges. Is it just the business, for example? And so they're actually, you know, first of all, there was this sort of story, I suppose, that there were a lot of famous musicians who died at the age of 27. So this is the 27 Club. I could name them all for you later if you'd like, but I'm sure you recognize a few of those faces. So these are famous musicians in their 20s and 30s. And so in the UK, some researchers did a retrospective cohort study looking at famous musicians in their 20s and 30s and found that in fact it was true that that they were 2 to 3 times more likely to die than the UK population. And so this does seem to hold true. So there are some genre differences. There's been, you know, some really interesting studies looking at, you know, pop and rock and rap musicians and whether they're more likely to die than classical musicians, for example. But the point is that the business can be very, very challenging. And my argument with this would be that I'm more concerned about what might cause some of those problems. I'm more concerned with the childhood traumas and other things that might follow people through to having difficulty that, you know, causes overdoses and other things that happened at the age of 27. So that kind of goes back to my previous slide talking about the interconnectedness between physical and mental health. So the problem with assessment becomes that we haven't really gotten to the point in musicians' health where we have a whole bunch of assessments to choose from that have all been tested on musicians. And so we know that they work on musicians and they're sensitive enough to pick up musicians' problems. And so what happens often when you go to see a health professional, and let's just say, you know, a physician or an orthopedic surgeon, and they are assessing a musician, they often will tend to sort of take the occupational injury route of assessing it. And what we know about the literature, so the research literature on occupational injuries, is that there's a ton of stuff out there on low back pain. If you have low back pain, we know lots about that. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about how to fix it, but we do know lots about it. Then kind of a second concern is upper extremities. So arms, shoulders, hands, those kinds of things are also concerned. They're, you know, big concern in factories and assembly lines, those sorts of things. And then really mental health, although it's now recognized as a really significant risk factor and contributor to the physical health, is really kind of considered a distant cousin in terms of healthcare practice related to occupational injuries. And many of the assessments that are used have really been validated on kind of average workers, healthy populations, in industry, those types of things. And so they may or may not be applicable in the music situation. And often we just don't know because the tests just haven't been done. And so it's often the case that you might end up at a doctor and have, you know, having the person say, okay, can you make a fist? Can you pronate and supinate? That's this movement here. You know, they might test your grip and pinch strength, and, you know, they might be recording things like you're within normal limits. But is within normal limits going to help us to be able to perform on our instruments? Is, you know, within normal limits pronation good enough if you are a violinist or a violist, for example? So, you know, these are questions that we want to have answered and are working sort of gradually towards. So that's sort of where we started with this project, was with an understanding that we need to be able to assess and that we need assessments that have been tested on musicians. And so to kind of throw another lens on that, so on top of the occupational health lens, talking a little bit about sort of the sports medicine connection in terms of elite performance demands. So you probably know this is Phil Collins. This is from In the Air Tonight. I'm showing my age here, but I love to think about this when I think about elite performance demands. So standard workplace tests, of course, might not be sensitive enough for elite demands. And there's been a couple of different studies that have found that this may be the case. And this is certainly recognized in athletes. We have a whole discipline of sports medicine, and it took a long time for that discipline to be established, but it is established now. And so people have this sort of basic understanding that athletes have particular needs, and that it requires some special care, but it hasn't really been as broadly accepted with musicians. And I would expand that and say dancers and other artists as well. But one of the principles that we pull from the sports medicine world that I think is useful is the test is the exercise and the exercise is the test. In other words, in order for us to determine whether someone is okay to go back to their valued occupation, what it is that they want to do in terms of music, the only way for us to really know that is to actually have them do that activity. And that creates some problems with assessment, because it's hard to standardize an assessment of drum playing. Like, how would I know if Phil Collins was performing up to his standard level of performance other than just asking him? So it becomes challenging to measure these things. So this study that we're talking about tonight, we call it the music cohort study. The original assessment battery was designed by my colleagues Christoph Zalpour and Nikki Ballenberger at the Hochschule Osnabrück, and Julius is going to tell me I'm terribly, my pronunciation is awful probably, but the Hochschule Osnabrück in Germany, and this the Institute for Physiotherapy and Osteopathy, which translates to INAPO. So Christoph was the one who established INAPO in the first place, and he and Nikki worked at establishing an assessment battery that was going to be administered to all of the incoming music students from the conservatory. And they all come into the physio clinic once a year at the beginning of the year, and they are given a baseline assessment, and then they're offered ongoing treatment. And I believe, and Julius can correct me later when he talks if I'm incorrect, that they have a follow-up as well. In fact, I think this might be your slide, Julius. I apologize, my notes aren't here. So why don't I let you do this one?
Yes, thank you. You are correct. They do have the follow-up, and as far as I know, there is a follow-up questionnaire being sent out once monthly throughout their entire degree. And at least that's the last I know. And then they're being tested in person once a year, unless there's loss to follow up. Yeah, and the following points here on the slide are just, I was taking a physio degree at the Hochschule, see, you pronounce it better than me, at the Hochschule Osnabrück. And for my bachelor's thesis, it was of interest to me to find a placement here in Canada. And Dr. Salpour knew Dr. Guptill and created this contact. And so I was able to, basically for my thesis, or turn my thesis into a trial of the protocol here in Canada. And with the idea, is this assessment battery that was designed in a German, in a European context, is it valid, and can we use it in a North American setting? And Dr. Guptill kind of talked about that point a little bit already. The idea for us here in Canada was to establish a baseline assessment. And we were specifically looking at first-year music students. And over 3 years, we ended up recruiting 19 music subjects or musicians and 15 current role students. And yeah, I think that would be the next slide. Yes, thank you. And so, yeah, the main research questions for our trial pilot study here in Canada were, again, is it applicable in this different cultural and professional setting? We were also hoping to get some insight into gender differences within the music student population, and whether there are differences between the between music students with acute injuries compared to those without acute injuries. We were also looking at playing duration, whether the exposure of playing their instrument has effects on their on their mental and physical well-being. And then the last point, whether there is, and Dr. Guptill talked about that earlier, whether we can see the connection that we believe to be there in the data, actually. And so that gave us something to work with. We, for the pilot study, chose a cross-sectional design with a non-musician control group. And yeah, as I kind of talked about already, we tried to capture both the physical and mental health profiles of both groups there. And I think I am handing it back to you for a slide. Yes.
Yeah, at least for this slide, yes. So what was interesting was we wanted, we thought that actually doing this in Canada was going to be fairly straightforward. Of course, we knew that there was some translation that was going to need to happen. The team had created sort of a pre-questionnaire, and then they were going to use some already validated assessment tools afterwards. But the pre-questionnaire was not a validated tool, and it, of course, had been written in German, and so we knew that was going to have to happen. But we ran into problems that we didn't really expect to, which is just so research, right? It's just so the way that things always go. And so, we had this translation glitch at one point where, even though, as you can see, Julius is very, very fluent, we had the German question asked for what sports do you engage in? And Julius, you can correct me if I'm saying that incorrectly, but and so that's how it got translated. But of course, in the German context, what that sort of implied was what physical activity do you engage in, which is not the same thing in Canada. And so we had a lot of, especially music students, saying, well, I don't play sports, so why is that a problem? And so then we ended up having to change that question for future cohorts. So for the first small group of people that we tested, we didn't have answers to that question. And then in terms of locating assessment tools and questionnaires, again, we thought that was going to be very straightforward, but we ran into interesting problems. So for example, the German group were using a questionnaire that I knew that we were using in another context. And I said, oh, great, that's published, here it is, we'll pull that up. And then when we started analyzing the data, Julius sort of said to me, so we have an interesting problem. We have a different number of question answers than the German study has. And so we asked them, like, what's happening here? Well, as it turned out, the author of that assessment tool had revised it, but not published it in a journal article in the revised version. And then with the revised version had started doing translations. So the German group were using the translated revised version, and we were using the original, and they had a different number of answers. So that was fun. So these are the things that you get into in research that are just a party. And I have to talk about the SF12 or the RAND 12 just for a quick second, because it's just so funny to me that the people that wrote these really, really ubiquitous health questionnaires called the SF tools, like the SF36, the SF12, they get used in hospitals and all over the place, all over the world. And we wanted to use them because we have norms for how Canadians perform, generally healthy Canadians perform on these tests. And it turned out that the original people who created these had an argument, and one of them wanted to sell it and make money, and the other one thought that because they had been funded by public dollars, they shouldn't. And so now the second one has their own company that sort of offers things free of charge, and it became quite complex, not to mention the fact that the algorithm that's used for these tools makes a basic assumption that your physical health and mental health are separate. And that's a really odd assumption to me, especially working with people who have more kind of chronic conditions. And so it turns out that at U of A, there's a whole research group that have created their own algorithm that gets rid of that basic assumption, and you can calculate the results in a somewhat different way. And so that added a whole level of complexity to the study that we didn't know in advance. So good fun. Okay, good. And I think I passed recruitment back to you, Julius, or did you want me to talk about this one? I can't recall.
Happy to talk about it.
Okay. So, oh, yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, for recruitment, we for the music students, actually, we ended up going into their classes. We kind of chose one class where everybody had to attend, and talked to them there and tried to get their attention. And but that obviously wasn't feasible for the controls, because we were recruiting from any first-year student, undergrad, who was not in a music degree. So that would have been a lot of classes to attend. But we sent out some emails. We had posters and flyers all over the campus, and we did include some incentives. And then we ended up actually also expanding to a second campus. The University of Alberta has the main campus in Edmonton, of course, and actually also has a satellite campus in Camrose, and there they have also a music program. And so we tried to recruit, and were able to recruit some more people from there as well. And
I'm cheating by pulling out my notes. Yeah,
I'm
cheating because I wanted to remind myself of who was talking by pulling this up on a separate computer. There we go. And this is you as well. So
yes, but I think you moved backwards.
I did. I don't know how that
Yes.
works. There it is. Okay. Thank you.
There we go. So just to give you a rough idea of what we did with our participants, or what they did with us, the big bulk was practical testing. So we did some range of motion measurement. We did some general core strength measurements. We did some Meccano Sensitivity, which I believe I will talk a little bit about later, just to get a general idea of their physical health, and then also did some paper pencil tests. Dr. Guptill spoke to earlier, where we ran into some interesting issues. And at the end, we provided them with a little bit of a wrap up about, what we could immediately see. Some of the data some of the paper tests we first had to analyze, but some of them we could kind of get an instant idea, and then just the general, if you can hold a plank for 10 seconds, it's below the norm, and we know that, and we could kind of talk to that already right there, and give them a general idea. And that kind of concluded the testing sessions. Yeah. And that next one, I believe, is you.
Yes, it is. Sorry. There we go. I apologize. My mouse keeps freezing, and then it's really fun. So in terms of the testing, so you can see there's a variety of things that we looked at. That SF is there. We used the depression, anxiety, and stress scale. We used the musician's health. It's the musculoskeletal pain, intensity, and interference questionnaire for musicians, which is a mouthful. So that's the MPI-IQM, which has been validated on a population of professional musicians. The KMPI is the one that we use, the revised version, because it has an original, it has a revised. And then we looked at people's ROM, stands for range of motion. So we looked at people's range of motion. The theory being that musicians have some more range, particularly in parts of the body that they use for their instruments, but in general also, musicians seem to have more hypermobility than the normal population. And we're not really sure why that is. So we did want to look at range of motion in the upper and lower extremity and in the neck. Pain sensitivity, we'll talk a little more about that. Isometric strength, and that's the core, the planks, and we sort of did, I call it a reverse plank. I don't know if anyone else does, but sort of hanging off the end of a table and holding yourself straight. So it requires quite a lot of back strength to do that. And a hypermobility score itself. And then we also measured hand span because we were interested in seeing if there was a relationship between hand span and injuries. So this is some of the findings. We're pulling out some of the more significant findings just to show you tonight so that you have some sense of some of the things that we found. We have submitted this for publication, so if and when it does come out, we will have a little bit more to say at that point. But certainly, just at sort of a baseline analysis, we could see that between our groups of musicians and non-musician controls, there were some baseline differences in level of physical activity and in nutrition that were significant. And in early stages, there was some significance in alcohol, but as it turned out, when we recruited a larger number, that difference disappeared. So otherwise, they were quite comparable in terms of the groups themselves. And then if we look at prevalence of playing-related musculoskeletal disorder, that's the PRMD, our sample of musicians reported, there were 68.4% of the music students that we tested who said that they had experienced a problem, physical problem that interfered with their ability to play their instrument or sing at some point in their careers. And of those, 31.6 reported that they had had those symptoms in the last 7 days. So that was sort of the point prevalence of 7 days. And you can see that we've mapped out where kind of current symptoms, concerning symptoms were. And so the most concerning is the red, which is the right dorsal forearm, was the biggest area of concern for people in terms of just number of people reporting it, not in terms of necessarily severity. And then yellow is the next kind of most common, which was left wrist and hand, left dorsal forearm, left volar forearm. Volar is the front side, dorsal is the back side. And green was right wrist and hand, shoulder, neck, and low back. So these are the places where people complain about having symptoms. And if we look at core endurance, this was another thing where we found some significant difference between our musician and non-musician controls. So the full plank was significant. You can see that, I'm not sure why I didn't circle those. There was a reason, but in any case, there certainly were differences with the right and left sided plank as well. And this Bering-Sorensen is the reverse one that I was talking about, where you're sort of hanging off the end of a table and holding yourself still in the air. Julius, I don't know if you remember off the top of your head what the norm was for our age range for a full plank, like how long you're meant to be able to hold a full plank. I know it's over 2 minutes, but I can't recall how much.
I want to say 125 seconds or somewhere around there, but please do not quote me on that.
So it's quite long, but these are young adults, right? And so so it's just something for you to take home with you and kind of see if you can work your way up to what an 18, 19, 20-year-old should be able to do, because I think planks are a good exercise, but it was interesting to watch it happen in the lab as well. Is that basically it was just do a plank and hold it, and no music. We did a little encouraging, but beyond that, it's just hold it as long as you can until you can't anymore. So Meccano Sensitivity, I think I was going to pass this one off to you, Julius, to talk a little bit about what that is.
Yes, sure. So Meccano Sensitivity is basically, really in a nutshell, how much can we push before you say it hurts. So we have a little machine with a 1 square centimeter in size probe, and that is being applied to different measuring points on the participant. And those are standardized, and where exactly we found them, all that. And yeah, then we literally apply pressure, continuously increasing pressure until the person says, this is uncomfortable. Not I can feel it, hopefully they feel it right away, but this is uncomfortable, this is painful. And that's the reading we take. And then it was interesting to see, I mean, all the red ones are the ones that were statistically significant in difference. But every single one of them, the musicians performed lower, so less pressure before pain. And I guess that is just interesting, as there is in the literature, there have been links described between Meccano sensitivity and stress levels. So With
Yeah,
our
there's
with our size, we can't make any big conclusions, but the
Yeah.
trend was definitely there.
Yeah, and so there are some interesting theories about why this might be, and certainly it's been demonstrated in the literature before. One of the things that I thought was interesting about this over the period of the study, and this is complete speculation on my part, but given that many of the musicians were not terribly involved in physical activity, we also know that, with experience, you develop sort of that sense that there's sort of a healthy level of pain that comes from, say, doing a physical activity that you haven't done for a little while, or that you're not used to, something new. You might be sore for a day or two afterwards, and that's quite normal pain. And so we call that delayed onset muscle soreness. And it's not dangerous. It doesn't cause any kind of long-term effects, versus kind of pain that is not healthy and that you should avoid. And so we often talk about pain as something that we shouldn't get into and that we should avoid doing. But to some extent, exertion is going to be somewhat uncomfortable. And so I did kind of wonder in my mind whether more experience with physical activity might make this different. But certainly the mental health component is another one that, as Julius was suggesting, has been linked to chronic pain levels, and stress can cause physical discomfort as well. And so, it's very difficult to tease these apart, but certainly it was interesting to see that there was such a significant difference between the musicians and controls in our study. There we go. So now we're looking at symptoms of mental illness. Oh, sorry, my daughter just walked behind me. I apologize, everyone. So here we're looking at depression, anxiety, and stress as being quite common mental problems that we encounter in clinical practice and in the general population. These are all people who reported symptoms of mental illness, not necessarily a diagnosed mental illness, but symptoms related to depression, anxiety, or stress. And you can see that the gray bar is musicians, the black bar is non-musicians. And for each of these, except for depression, which was roughly the same, you can see that the musicians had higher rates of anxiety and stress. And so that was also interesting to us. And so, sort of begs the question of what's happening. Is this something that people are predisposed to? Is this something related to the training? Is this, there's lots of questions to be answered. So I think that's it for the this particular study, and I want to kind of move into talking about a couple of other things, but I thought I'd give you a brief little musical interlude for a second. So I'm going to just show this score for the musically inclined. This was the piece of music that sort of broke me in my undergrad in music. I was in second year music, the only oboe major in the entire undergrad program. And I was asked to play oboe in the Barber Violin Concerto for someone's master's degree graduate recital. And I saw this score and I practiced it like mad. And this is presto, by the way. I apologize. And I saw that I was in unison with some of the other instruments, and so I practiced it like mad. But if you go and listen to a recording of the Barber Violin Concerto, you will never hear this. So it does beg the question as to whether, us young undergrads maybe need a little bit more experience as to when we really should kind of work for hours and hours to make something perfect. So I'm just going to play you a little musical interlude for a moment, so you have a sense of what was going on there. So it's in this mess here. So, and not to suggest that we would ever want to perform that in a less than ideal manner, but I just want to know if anyone noticed the oboe player playing in that section. So that's just my suggestion. I'm just not really sure that that if I played a couple of wrong notes, whether anyone would have noticed. In any case, so I'm just going to move on to talk about a couple of other things that I just wanted to bring into this. So this was such an interesting study for us to do, and I was so pleased to be able to work with Julius and to be able to collaborate with my colleagues in Germany. Just kind of tip of the iceberg, really, of trying to understand how we best assess musicians in a valid and reliable way. And so with instruments that we know are going to perform and do the things we want them to do. At the same time, I was working with a colleague of mine from Australia who we were putting together a course effectively for health professionals, and it eventually expanded to educators on sort of an introduction to performing arts medicine. And so this included more than just musicians. And as a part of that, we were putting together this assessment battery, which we called a pre-participation exam. It's important to kind of understand why that's a pre-participation exam. It's because if you think of how athletes who are recruited to university teams, for example, they come in August and they're put through a battery of tests with the trainers that helps them to identify if the athletes have a weakness or a susceptibility to an injury so that they can work on it before the season starts. And so that's what we were sort of putting together. So with a bunch of expert clinicians, bring them all together in a bunch of meetings and ask them what are the tools that work best for them. So very different way of creating an assessment. The first one was sort of informed very much by research. It was trying to pick assessments that would perform statistically well and that were also clinically useful at the same time, and be useful for following in terms of research to be able to show a difference in treatment over time. This was really like the quick and dirty, how do we best get to the heart of the matter, find the problems that performers might be having and identify them quickly so that they can get follow-up. And sort of the idea being that you might screen a large number of people. So you might screen an entire orchestra, you might screen an entire dance company, for example. And so that's what this was. And as I said, sort of a professional consensus process included physicians, PTs and OTs, athletic trainers, osteopaths, psychologists, and psychiatrists. There was some input from ear, nose, and throat doctors and audiologists as well. And it's definitely more comprehensive than the previous set of assessments, in part because it also includes other performers, not just musicians, but also because the clinicians wanted a slightly more comprehensive group of assessments. And so not like these two batteries of assessment look really quite different in terms of what's in them. I'll show you in a minute. And they're informed more by collective experience than by research that shows that over time, this test performs the same, or that it has a particular validity score and that sort of thing. So the content, so there was an activity chart, which was quite extensive. How much do you practice, particular types of practice, types of performance, multiple other activities, what sorts of exercise do you do? So in that way, kind of quite similar to the German one, but with some slight differences. And it also included an exertion rating, so a self-report of like how much effort do you put in, for this percentage of the day sort of thing. Certainly, we also asked about alcohol in the professional one. And we used some particular tools for that rather than just, how many drinks would you have on an average period. Medical and orthopedic history, body chart, symptom mapping. There is some body chart mapping in the MPI-IQM that was used in the other one. And nutrition and hydration, that they had that in common, and also some women's health questions in particular. We had the disability of arm, shoulder, and hand. There's a particular module in that, which is only 4 questions, specifically directed at the performing arts and sports population. And we use that in particular. And there are elements of that in the MPI-IQM as well. There is a specific rating scale of dystonia. Now, this was not in the INAPO study from Germany, but that was in the DIVA. There's an embouchure self-rating, so very, very specific. Fitness questionnaire, a psychological history and screen. So we're still looking at mental health, but using a different tool for it, much sort of quicker and dirtier, getting to the heart of the matter. The psychological history and screen has some very direct questions about suicidal ideation, for example. And again, that music performance anxiety tool that we were using, the CAMPI, and a vocal and audiological screen, which sort of were not really present in the music cohort study. So then we moved in the DIVA to some manual testing, which included spine movement, lower limb, obviously, and ballet screen for dancers, some core strength, like we did with the music cohort study, some upper limb range of motion, strength, some provocative tests for particular problems like carpal tunnel syndrome, for example, and then some evaluation of the jaw and face. We did the Meccano Sensitivity in the jaw and face in the music cohort study, but this assessment was kind of more specific, which makes sense when you're looking at dancers and actors and and considering some other injuries. Right, so I just wanted to kind of finish that by saying that it's just interesting as a researcher when you approach finding a battery of assessments from 2 different angles, like when you approach it from the perspective of we want to bring in music students into an environment where we want to produce some research out of this and really kind of do very rigorous research-based work that's going to come out with statistical significance that we can follow for periods of time, versus bringing a bunch of clinicians into a room together and saying, what's your favorite tests, which is basically what the DIVA did. And so there certainly was crossover, but they ended up, looking fairly different, and so aren't necessarily comparable in a research situation, but it was just really neat to have the opportunity to be involved in both at the same time. The last thing I want to talk about is the study that I'm doing right now, which kind of follows from this. So it's all well and good to say, how do we appropriately assess students? But sort of the next stage of that is, how do we help to improve the situation so that students and future professionals don't get hurt as often? And so my colleagues in Australia had been working for some time on an online course designed to teach music students about anatomy and some mental health components and other things, body positioning, and a variety of different things, to help them to understand better and be able to seek better care and take better care of themselves. And so for a couple of years now, we have been running a trial of this, so that offering that online course and offering it in the context of a blended learning course, and that's going on at Lethbridge, where the students are taking a credit course and they have to do the online component, but then they also get some face-to-face time in the classroom with a professor, in this case, online actually, delivery this year. And that trial is happening at 3 different Canadian universities, from a very large university to quite small undergrad-focused university at Lethbridge. And other trials are taking place worldwide, not just in Canada, but obviously I'm sort of in charge of the Canadian component of it. And we also are looking at some educational outcome measures, like what are the grades, what are students' reflections looking like, certainly some health measures looking at physical, psychological, and behavioral components of health. And there's also a combination of that statistical component, but also combined with some qualitative. So we've got focus groups running where we're asking the students what their experience of that online course is like. And that study is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. I am intending and hoping to expand that to the professional world as well. So we've been in discussion with sorry, I'm blanking, with Orchestras Canada and the Organization of Canadian Symphony Musicians about the possibility of extending that to professional musicians in Canada over time. So we need some funding and some staff for that, but certainly hope to be able to offer it to professional musicians. It will require a bit of retooling because it was designed for students. So we do want to be able to, for instance, we want to be able to hone in on a particular instrument, for example, and someone who plays trombone might not be terribly interested in seeing a bunch of stuff having to do with string players, but maybe they would, hard to say, but give them a little bit of choice about picking and choosing what elements of the course to take, for example. So I just encourage anyone who's seeing if they're interested in this sort of work to please get involved. If you are an educator, if you're involved in music education, build your ecological network with health, rehab, kinesiology peers, reach out. There's often people who are interested. It's amazing the number of health professionals out there who have some music training who would be really keen to be able to interact with musicians a little bit more. Share your realities. I encourage you to get your subjective experience and the intricacies of your performance requirements and an understanding of the business out there. Certainly if you're consulting with healthcare practitioners, don't let them cut you off. Make sure they understand what you're going through. You can certainly follow me on social media. I do have a Twitter account, although I'm not a consistent user of Twitter all the time. And I'm on Facebook, and I actually have an Instagram account, although I hardly ever use it. But I do try to post elements of my research up there and interesting things that I know, services that I see that are going on that are relevant to musicians' health on a very regular basis. And there certainly are lots of learning opportunities. As I said, I'll share these slides with Dr. Smallwood so that if you want to see these links, you can have them. But you know, there's an article that JSTOR I didn't articulate, but it's an article I wrote in 2010 in Music Educators Journal about what music teachers could do in this regard. Encourage you certainly to come to the Performing Arts Medicine Association and take the certificate course, which because of COVID, we were going to do it anyway, but COVID forced our hands to offer the entire course online. Certainly check out the PAMA website, the Performing Arts Medicine Association website. The College Music Society, the International Society of Music Educators, the Music Teachers National Association all have musicians' health committees, which you can join and be involved in what's going on in those committees. And they do some really, really amazing educational initiatives. I've done webinars for CMS and MTNA before. Certainly read the Medical Problems of Performing Artists Journal, which is a great place to get lots of really deep information about musicians and other performers' health. There's a lot, it's quite slanted towards music though. There's a lot more music content than other content. And then stay tuned. You know, certainly feel free to stay in touch with me. I think my email address is on the first slide, so you're more than welcome to reach out if you have any particular questions. And I'm going to end with a little bit of a music clip, but I'm happy to stick around for questions. So thank you so much for coming tonight. And I'll leave you with some fiddling. You may want to turn your volume down before I play this, because this is my former client who gives me permission to share. You'll see in the video that I'm going to show you that she's actually wearing a silver ring splint that I suggested that she wear because she was having some problems with her small finger. And so I'll play this now. So you may want to turn your volume down. And thank you so much for coming, and I'll stick around for questions. I'm just going to end that. I'll maybe play it. I'll maybe play it later, but I'll stop sharing so that I can see you all. Yay.
Thank you so much. That was really fantastic, and it was so fun to see
Okay.
that last performance. So as requested, just for those of you who are interested in following up, what we'll do is we'll post the slides on the website, where we also post the video after the talk. So give us a few days to do that. But hopefully if you can check that out if you're interested. And I also want to just make a plug here, or an appeal to the students among us, and actually anyone who's affiliated with a university or involved. And that is just, if you see some signs up around the university asking for volunteers for various kinds of psychological experiments or things like this, I know how hard it is to recruit people, and I know that Christine worked very, very hard to recruit the students who participated in this study, but it's really hard to do. And so I just want to encourage you to consider doing that if you have the time. Sometimes you even get paid a little bit of money, but even if not, it's usually a really wonderful experience to be able to share your experiences with researchers. I did it a lot when I was a student, and I found it to be really quite fascinating and fun. So thanks again for this really great talk. And I see that we're a little over 8 o'clock now, so I know that some of you have to go. And so just again, thanks everyone for coming tonight. But I would like to take a few moments for some questions, because I know some people have some, and if you do need to go, thanks again, and we'll see you next time. But I wanted to maybe start things off with a question that I was thinking about during your talk, which is just a sort of general question, kind of on in the same realm as what you were talking about with the online course about musicians' health, but more a question about, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about any kinds of efforts there might be to create sort of group exercise classes for musicians that are similar to what dancers do. And I'm thinking, for example, about the sort of Eurythmics fad during the 90s that I know that a lot of music departments implemented, which always seemed to me a little bit more like a team building exercise than an actual than actual exercise, but it seemed like a good idea. And I always wondered whatever became of that. By the way, I'm not talking about the band from the 80s. I'm talking about a movement class for musicians. And I don't actually know that much about it. But I just kind of remember, and I've seen that on student transcripts, so I know some of those programs are still in existence. But I just wanted to ask if you had any thoughts about those kinds of things and whether or not they're useful, or whether there's any more of that kind of activity happening in music departments.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, I think that we don't have a ton of evidence to be able to kind of suggest one over another, and that's particularly of musicians, but it's kind of general as well. It's funny, I think I was telling you ahead of time, like before everyone came in, Scott, about the defense that I was at the other day, and they were testing some exercise interventions on medical students. And you'd be surprised, there's tons of crossover between what medical students go through and what musician students go through. They also have lots of stress and don't have much time and all kinds of things. And there's not a ton of evidence to kind of suggest one exercise over another. I tend to be a bit glib about this. I was just saying to Julius the other day that, the best exercise is the one you will do. But the study that this student was conducting in kinesiology was suggesting that women seem to benefit a little bit more from group exercise, and men seemed to sort of like individual exercise. Now that's of course, assuming that your genders are only binary, which is not a great assumption. Certainly we should be looking at a more diverse conception of that, but it's interesting to consider that we probably as human beings get some social element out of group exercise that could be beneficial. And it could also help us to kind of stay on our exercise targets, because when we get busy, we tend to kind of drop anything that's not dead essential, and physical exercise tends to be one of the ones we drop, right? And so if you're kind of surrounded by people who are coming around you and saying, hey, listen, we need to go out for a walk because we haven't done anything other than sit in the practice room all day today, even though it's -30 out, and I empathize. I mean, I did live through that for sure. It's not quite so cold here. This is Gatineau Park in my background, but lots of snow, not so cold. But certainly I think there's an element of the social that is really, really important. So offering it in place and seeing your like seeing the people that mentor you, seeing your faculty members and your teachers doing those kinds of things, there's a strong benefit to that, I think, in terms of encouraging people to have an active lifestyle. And let's face it, you know, if we establish those things young, then it's more beneficial. So I think, you know, even from, you know, Scott, when you and I were in high school and university, I think that the younger generation, Julius would probably maybe agree with this, I don't know. I think that it's more encouraged for kids to be more engaged in that kind of stuff. It used to be that if you were an artsy person, you didn't do sports, and vice versa, right? And so I think we're doing a better job as a society of encouraging people to do this. But I think, you know, more visibility is always good. When I was at NYO, for some years now have had, not me personally, I didn't attend NYO. I worked at NYO, so just to be clear. But when I was working with NYO, they had a running club, and that was really beneficial for some people. Like lots of them had not necessarily run before, some had, and that was really good because it encouraged them to just get out and running. Let's face it, is not very expensive, doesn't require membership. There's not a ton of equipment involved. You can kind of do it anywhere. You can do it on tour. It's nice when you have other people to run with. So, you know, I go back to what I had said before. I think the best exercise is the one that you will do, and it's all about finding that. But encouragement socially is beneficial. Julius, was there anything you thought you should know? Okay.
Nope, you summarized that quite nicely.
I did note David Lay's comment about Alexander technique, which is another, I'd forgotten about that one, but another sort of group exercise thing. I think I know some theater departments do that, and I've heard some music departments do it too, and dance departments. Yeah, so I'm now just looking, thank you for that answer. That was really great. I'm just looking to see if there are any other questions. And I know some of you may be flummoxed by not being able to unmute yourself. So what I would say is if you would like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function or put your question in chat. And then we may just invite you to unmute, or we'll read the question out if you have it. So if you don't, that's fine, but just want to make sure we get them all answered if there are any more tonight. So
I'm glad to see David is here, actually. I'll hop on that for a second and say that anything that raises body awareness is really important. He knows I feel this way about it as well, is that, you know, we sometimes as musicians especially get really trapped in what it is that we're producing, you know, out there in terms of notes and tempo and sound production, blah, blah, and not thinking so much about the body that's actually doing the producing. And it's kind of a bizarre thing. I think dancers must think we're really weird, that we have no concept of what's going on bodily. And so that can be very, very critical. I think anything that will raise body awareness is good. I know Alexander technique is one way to do that. There's also, you know, body mapping and Feldenkrais and yoga and all kinds of different things that can help you be more attuned to what your body is doing. But I think, you know, anything that helps to bring awareness to the body that's actually making the music is probably important.
thank you for that. Going once. Don't see any other questions tonight. People are probably ready to get warm. It's been at least here in Edmonton such a cold last few days, and doesn't seem to be letting up. So maybe we'll go ahead and call it a night. But I just wanted to again thank you, and if everyone would like to, and for those of you who are still here, just unmute yourself and take your video off, and let's give Christine and Julius a nice warm and applause. You can pretend you can hear it.
Thanks for coming, everyone.